Hi there, this is William Young. Coretta Scott King said in 1970 that it would be 50 years before the full assessment of her husband's life could begin to be made. And so here we are, 50 years after his assassination, and we're the generation who has to reflect on what we've become, and to quote him, uh, uh, where do we go from here? And so in this video I want to talk about my own personal encounters with Dr. King's life and his legacy, and the people around his life who became people around my life, and to reflect a little bit too on how the church measures up to the standards and the legacy that the civil rights movement paved, and at least that spiritual dimension of the movement which Dr. King facilitated. Dr. King's life runs very deep to mine, and it goes back to my second day on earth. My father was a pastor in Louisville, Kentucky when I was born, and he worked there with a group of ministers and civil rights leaders, including Muhammad Ali. And so as he told me, and others have told me, and including the person involved, on my second day on earth I was visited by the Reverend Charles Elliott, a pastor in Louisville, Kentucky, who had marched with Dr. King in the 60s. And he blessed me and gave sort of a prophetic uttering to me, that to my parents, that something great would happen to this young man, and that's always been something that has stayed with me. That was Louisville, where I was born, and then I was raised in Cincinnati, and as well in Cincinnati I was basically I spent my formative years in the Black Baptist Church, and regularly sheltered by pastors who had major roles in the civil rights movement. Amongst them, most famously was the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who knew my family closely, who supported my ministry in my early years, even gave me the nickname Little Young because of my youth and my activity. My own pastor, Reverend H.L. Harvey, in Cincinnati, was very close to him, and gave the eulogy, in fact, at Shuttlesworth's funeral. And even his daughter was in my life, Ruby Bester, who is still alive, and a lovely woman, who directed the children's choir of our Baptist Association. And so I as a child, I was sheltered. I was chaperoned by Ruby Bester, Shuttlesworth's daughter. And she even had the authority by my parents to whoop me, to chastise me when I was seen doing wrong. And so I was always exposed to this sense of somebodiness, certainly. I matriculated at American Baptist College in Nashville, and Vanderbilt Divinity School, two institutions, two theological institutions in the South that had a very positive influence on the civil rights movement. Trained several of the leaders of that movement, James Lawson of Vanderbilt, leading the sit-in movement, as well as John Lewis was an alumnus, is an alumnus of American Baptist College. James Bevel and others, and so you become immersed in that. And at Vanderbilt, I became immersed in exploring globalization, which, long story short, has led me to some of the work that I do here in Scotland. One of the moot points that I consider around Martin Luther King's life, beyond all of the great moments in those 12 years, and all the astute quotes that we can spout off, those King quotes. But one of the moot points that I consider is his well-being, his health, how he juggled local pastoral life and then leading the community. It's not always a match made in heaven, and it can be something that in the end affects one's well-being. It is said that when King died, he was 39 years old, but the coroner said that he had the heart of a 60-year-old. And that's not from heavy smoking or fast living. That's from carrying the burden of liberation and resistance. That's from giving everything you have to the struggle. After the Montgomery bus boycott, he was asked about what it's like achieving fame so early. And King said, "I'm worried to death. People will be expecting me to pull rabbits out of my hat for the rest of my life." And so there is a cost to this struggle. And I see so much of that kind of life reflected in the most recent passing of Sister Erica Garner at the age of 27, who gave all of her energy to seek justice for her father's murder and to in turn become a leading light and a symbol of the Black Lives Matter movement nationwide, globally. So I'm reminded of the heavy toll that our lives can take as we work to reclaim a sense of integrity and order in democracy, in America and in the world. There's so much anger in the global political climate and amongst young people in particular. We've got to learn to take care of ourselves in the struggle. And there's a quote that I want to show. I want to give you. I know I'm going over time, but it's by Rebecca Solnit, and I offer it to you. Joy doesn't betray activism, but joy sustains activism. And when you face a politics that aspires to make you fearful, alienated, and isolated, joy is a fine initial act of insurrection. So we have to learn to take care of ourselves in the struggle and learn to enjoy the struggle as well. To me, two of the greatest moments in 20th century history will always be civil rights movement in America and the apartheid struggle in South Africa. They are movements that could not have been sustained without a spiritual impetus. The church was the center of the civil rights struggle, just as Bishop Tutu did his thing in South Africa in the wake of Mandela's imprisonment. And so the church has been the center of the struggle, not so much because of the centrality of the church in the black community and in the African and African communities, but because of the spiritual impetus that was required, I think, to make people conscious of the moral necessity for change. I mean, as I had said, you had the NAACP, you had the great legal geniuses of the 20th century working on the legal end. But in those 12 years that MLK facilitated the civil rights struggle, the spiritual urgency made the difference. And it's interesting that in the same era where Billy Graham televangelized, Norman Vincent Peale was motivating people like the Trump family, King and scores of clergy and people who chose to go his way took that same spiritual drive Peale and Graham was utilizing, but in order to transform the foundations of reality, not for fame or success sake, but for justice and for America to live out the true meaning of its creed. And so I wonder where our spiritual drive will come from in the 21st century, in the continuing anger and anxiety that we see in our world. What will our collective affirmation of self come from? Another thing I'm interested in with King is his study of personalism at Boston University. Not simply the philosophical and theological foundations, but he also understood the economic underpinnings of personalism. In Memphis, that fateful night, he left us with the fact that the black community in 1968 was worth $30 billion. And of course, today the spending power of the black community is far greater than that. But that would have been the first time, probably. I'm willing to bet that was the first time, probably. Many folk in Memphis would have known how much they are worth as a people. That was King not talking about profit or prosperity, but King talking about economic well-being and economic power possessed already by the people. When he talked about that street sweeper, it's your lot to be a street sweeper, be the best street sweeper there ever was. That was more than motivational talk. That was philosophical truth for him. When he affirmed the power of black is beautiful, he wasn't being trendy because the young people were saying it. That was King asserting the foundation of his very outlook on life. And so personalism is a crucial philosophical movement in the 20th century, and it, I think, is a crucial element in understanding the intellectual foundations of Martin Luther King's leadership. And so there's no question that King's legacy has been a model for black ministers, and certainly for me, because of that prophetic connection that he had and others had with the Christian imagination. And not wanting to be the for-profit, but being the prophet of God. Not the high priest of empire, but prophets of the Most High God, in the words of William Barber. King even said of his own mentors, including George Kelsey, Benjamin Mays, Howard Thurman. He said of people like them, I could see in their lives the ideal of what I wanted a minister, a real minister, to be. And even in that fateful speech in the Church of God in Christ headquarters on the 3rd of April, 68, he praised the work of Memphis leaders like James Lawson, at the time in Memphis, for their relevant, what he called their relevant ministry. He said, so often preachers aren't concerned about anybody but themselves. So even they had that in 1968. So I think that in the minds of many black clergy, if you ask them their models for ministry, first would be Jesus, should be. The second should be Martin Luther King. And certainly it has been my goal for ministry to maybe not wear King's shoes, but to at least consult his cobbler for my own shoes. And so it's crucial, disturbing and exciting to see where the African American church is in this 50th year since King's departure from our world. And I think the greatest sign of what has happened to the black church is found in Ebony magazine. Every year, Ebony magazine posts the 100 most influential people. And as a kid, I used to always read those lists. And there was a day where you could count on a fourth of the people in the list to be clergy, male or female clergy. Not megachurch pastors, but leaders of denominations, leaders of major social projects, politicians, that kind of thing. Last year's list in 2017, what they call the power people now, not one person is a clergy person. You got one religious studies professor, no clergy. Now I think maybe it's a reflection on how much Ebony magazine too has changed, but I think it talks of the diminishing value of black religious leadership in the aftermath of the era of the mega churches. I've just seen a selling out of spirituality and all of the false pretenses of the prosperity gospel, and the propensity of those churches like that to support conservative politics and conservative policies that have indeed damaged the lives of the poorest and is doing the work even now of destroying black communities. My pastor in Nashville, Reverend James Thomas, tough-talking, Texas-born preacher, smoked 5 packs of cigarettes a day, still going strong at the age of 78, almost 79 he'll be next month. But he was preaching about gentrification and the coming of it. He didn't call it gentrification, but in the 1990s, because it was beginning even then. And he was a great prophetic figure. And he still is, but he saw it, the advent of that coming, because it was happening in the churches already. Churches wanting to move out in the suburbs, to build bigger. In the words of the proverb, Jesus tells, build a bigger barn, and create greater spaces for themselves, and moving out in the process of the black communities, historic black communities, and allowing people to have to drive or take a bus to get out to their mega church on a Sunday morning. And the churches that stayed in the community, like ours, saw declining numbers and a loss of the prophetic impulse in people in favor of the prosperity impulse. And that was the beginning, I think, of the remapping of boundaries that we now see, where wealthy young whites moving into the black community, black institutions being replaced with Whole Foods Market, and poor African Americans being transplanted closer to the mega churches than to public transport or jobs. And in time, what the black mega church helped to initiate represents the most dramatic disenfranchisement of people in our time, politically and economically. And so it's no wonder that the millennial generation has left the church, is leaving the church, has such critical feeling for the spirituality of the black church it has been for the last generation. And with people being so much more depersonalized and fragmented than people were 50 years ago, what resources are we going to are we going to use? What resources are we going to use to break this fragmentation and bring us more into solidarity with each other? I hasten on, but let me leave you with words in this critical moment as we try to reflect on and channel King's intellectual and spiritual foundations in an age like ours, where he couldn't possibly have dreamed for us. King couldn't possibly have dreamed of the political leadership guiding us, and to consider it moral and to be of God. A year on, and a president with the mouth and manners of a Bull Connor continues to reign, with staff who don't speak up, with a Republican Party that doesn't speak up. And so I'm mindful of the voices in King's life, the intellectual resources. And so let me leave you with one of those intellectual resources. Words by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German pastor who was executed by the Nazis at the same age as Dr. King, at the age of 39. King cherished his copy of Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from Prison just as he cherished and held in his pocket a copy of Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. But in that book, Letters and Papers from Prison, Bonhoeffer writes a letter about folly. It's 1944. He's in a prison cell. He's talking about folly, and specifically the political folly and disaster that was the reign of a tyrant over Bonhoeffer's own cultured, previously God-fearing nation. From the land of Reformation and religious freedom comes into Bonhoeffer's life a racist dictator. And he calls this folly, and he says, folly is a more dangerous enemy to the good than evil. One can protest against evil, but against folly we have no defense. Having thus become a passive instrument, the fool will be capable of any evil, and at the same time incapable of seeing that it is evil. Here lies the danger of a diabolical exploitation of humanity, which can do irreparable damage to the human character. He said that in 1944, not 2018. But he doesn't leave us there. Let me share with you finally what he prescribes that can save us from folly, from the fool. It is just at this point that we realize, he says, that the fool cannot be saved by education. The fool cannot be saved by military might. What he needs is redemption. There is nothing else for it. Until then, it is no earthly good trying to convince him by rational argument. As the Bible says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. In other words, the only cure for folly is spiritual redemption. For that alone can enable a man to live as a responsible person in the sight of God.